In the spring of 1944, thousands of German soldiers found themselves far from the battlefields of Europe. Captured by Allied forces, they were transported across the vast Atlantic Ocean to the heart of the United States. For many, it was their first glimpse of America. They expected concrete, soldiers, and barbed wire. Instead, they saw open fields, green pastures, and the quiet rhythm of rural life. The journey began in silence. Young men who once fought under the swastika now stared out the windows of trains, watching endless miles of farmland pass by. The air smelled of earth and corn. Everywhere they looked, they saw farmers at work. Men in denim overalls, women carrying baskets, children running through the grass. At first, the prisoners couldn't understand why they were being brought here. America had plenty of soldiers. Why send enemy troops to farms? But soon they realized the war had pulled away millions of American men. Farms needed hands. And so the prisoners of war became farm workers. When the trains finally stopped, they stepped out into a world that felt strangely peaceful. No bombs, no screams, only the wind, the smell of hay, and the hum of distant tractors. The American guards weren't cruel. They spoke firmly, but not with hate. Some even smiled. Prisoners were issued simple clothes, boots, and straw hats. They were told to work, and in return, they would be fed and treated fairly. It felt unreal. Just months earlier, they had been taught that Americans were monsters. Now, those same monsters were giving them fresh bread, coffee, and a place to sleep. As the days went by, the men began to feel a strange confusion. Was this really the enemy's land? Could people so kind, so ordinary, truly be at war with them? They worked long hours, harvesting wheat, milking cows, fixing fences. And while the sun burned their backs, they watched the farmers who supervised them. Strong, quiet men. Fair. Sometimes strict, but never cruel. In the evenings, the prisoners sat together outside their barracks, talking softly in German. Some sang old songs from home. Others just stared at the stars. Stars that looked exactly the same as the ones above Germany. One of them said quietly, "Maybe the Americans are not so different from us." The others laughed, but no one truly disagreed. By the end of the first week, a silent curiosity grew among the German POWs. Who were these farmers? Where'd they come from? Why did some of them pronounce certain words almost like Germans? They didn't know it yet, but they were about to uncover something that would shake their understanding of the entire war. It began with a single name. The following week, the German prisoners continued their work on the sprawling farms. At first, everything seemed ordinary. Cows in the barn, wheat swaying the breeze, the rhythmic clatter of horse hooves on dirt paths. But slowly, small details began to catch their attention. One afternoon, a young farmer named Schmidt approached them. He gave instructions in perfect English, but the prisoners immediately noticed something familiar. The name Schmidt rang like a bell in their ears, a name they knew from their own villages in Germany. "Schmidt?" one of the prisoners whispered. "Like the family in Hamburg." The farmer paused and smiled politely, unaware of the storm of recognition he had sparked. More names followed: Miller, Wagner, Becker. The men began to notice patterns everywhere. Signs on barns, labels on mailboxes, even the neighbors' greetings carried a subtle German sound. It was uncanny. The Americans they had been told were alien, enemies of the Reich, were descendants of the very people they might have called family long before the war began. During breaks, the POWs exchanged quiet conversations, their voices lowered to a whisper as they pieced together the puzzle. "Did you hear the name of the family down by the river? Kruger. That's my grandfather's name. And they have a farm just like in the Black Forest." It was as if history itself had folded upon them. The enemy land was not entirely foreign. It had threads of home woven quietly into the fields and villages. Over the next few days, their curiosity grew into fascination. The prisoners began paying closer attention to accents, gestures, and habits. Some farmers used traditional German greetings. "Guten Morgen," muttered softly to themselves while working. Some recipes passed down through generations resembled those the POWs had eaten as children. Potatoes, cabbage, sausages, they all tasted oddly familiar. The guards noticed the POWs' changing behavior. They seemed less tense, less hostile. Instead of the fear and resentment expected in prisoners, there was a quiet wonder, a contemplative energy. One evening, under the fading light, a prisoner named Hans approached the barn quietly. He spoke to a farmer, carefully asking about the family's history. To his surprise, the farmer smiled and explained that his great-grandparents had immigrated from Germany more than 100 years ago. They had settled here, worked the land, and raised children who now carried German surnames but lived as Americans in every other way. The revelation struck Hans deeply. All the lessons of war, all the propaganda about enemies and monsters suddenly felt less absolute. The people he had been told to despise were in many ways connected to him by blood, culture, and heritage. The POWs began to talk more openly about their discovery among themselves. Each new German-sounding name, each familiar custom, became a small bridge between the past and the present. It was impossible to ignore. As the sun set on the farm, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, the men sat quietly by the fence. They watched children chasing chickens, dogs barking happily, and farmers moving through the fields. A sense of disbelief lingered in the air. They were prisoners, yet here they were, witnessing the echoes of their homeland in a land they had been taught to hate. For the first time since capture, they felt a strange sense of belonging. Not in the sense of freedom, not yet, but in the sense of recognition. By the end of the week, the German POWs no longer approached their work with fear or anger. Every name, every custom, every familiar turn of phrase reminded them of a world they thought was lost. The farmers had unwittingly taught them a lesson more powerful than any they had learned in camps or classrooms. Enemies are often more alike than different, and history flows in ways that can surprise even the most skeptical mind. And so, life on the farm continued, but nothing felt ordinary anymore. Every sunrise carried a whisper of Germany. Every handshake, every shared task, every passing smile hinted at a connection that went beyond borders, beyond war, beyond expectation. By the third week on the farms, the German POWs began to notice subtle changes in their own hearts. The initial shock of discovering German roots among American farmers had transformed into curiosity, and eventually something resembling respect. The farmers, too, had started to notice the prisoners differently. What had begun as duty became awareness. Some men would pause in the fields to explain a new tool or technique, patiently showing how to mend fences or milk cows more efficiently. The POWs watched, listened, and learned, not as captives, but as human beings bridging the gap between two worlds. Conversations started slowly. Simple questions about weather or crops led to more personal exchanges. Hans asked a farmer about his family's journey from Germany. The farmer smiled, told stories of ships crossing the Atlantic, of towns left behind, and of dreams of a better life in America. The prisoners shared their own stories in return, childhood memories of villages in Bavaria and Hamburg, of local festivals and songs, of winters harsh and long, and summers filled with sun and harvests. The farmers listened intently, their hands still working, but their hearts open. By midweek, the POWs were no longer simply laborers. They were part of the rhythm of the farm. They helped plant, harvest, and repair, not out of obligation, but out of a growing sense of participation. The simple acts of work became a language of understanding, translating fear and suspicion into cooperation. Small gestures began to mean a lot. A loaf of fresh bread shared at the end of the day, a helping hand with a heavy bale of hay, a quiet nod of encouragement when a task was completed. These actions, seemingly ordinary, carried profound weight for men who had known only conflict and captivity. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the prisoners gathered with the farmers for a shared meal. Soup simmered over an open fire, bread was torn by hand, and laughter rang in the air. It was the first time the prisoners realized that bonds could exist even amidst war. Children ran between the tables, curious about the strangers who spoke German but worked so kindly alongside their parents. Hans smiled as he handed a small basket of eggs to a young girl, and she laughed, a sound so familiar, so human, that it stirred memories of home. The days passed with a rhythm that no one had anticipated. Farm work, meals, small talks, and quiet nights under the stars, all of it built a foundation of trust. The prisoners learned to anticipate the farmers' movements, to respect their routines, and to appreciate the discipline of farm life. And the farmers, in turn, discovered that these men, once labeled as enemies, were capable of diligence, integrity, and even humor. Stories were told around evening fires, jokes shared across fences, and moments of genuine connection formed without words. By the end of the third week, a subtle transformation had taken place. The POWs no longer viewed the Americans as simply captors or strangers. They were people, much like themselves, shaped by land, family, and heritage. The discovery of shared roots had opened the door, and through daily interactions, trust was slowly walking through. As the weeks went by, the German POWs began to notice even more uncanny similarities between the American farmers and their own homeland. It started with simple things: words, phrases, and mannerisms. A farmer would mutter, "Yeah, yeah," under his breath while directing livestock. A dish on the dinner table resembled a recipe they had eaten as children: roasted vegetables, cabbage, sausages, and breads that smelled like home. Small gestures, like the way a farmer folded hay into the barn loft, mirrored practices they remembered from farms in Bavaria and Saxony. Curiosity turned into fascination. The POWs began asking questions about traditions, local festivals, and family stories. Farmers spoke willingly, recounting celebrations long forgotten, songs sung during harvest, and tales of ancestors who had crossed the Atlantic centuries ago. The prisoners listened, enthralled, imagining their own villages and families in this strange yet familiar place. Friendships began to emerge in subtle ways. A prisoner might assist in mending a fence, and the farmer would respond with a nod of approval. A loaf of bread shared after a long day became a symbol of trust. Even chores took on a new meaning. They were no longer tasks imposed on captives, but acts of participation, gestures of connection. Some evenings, the farmers invited the prisoners to sit by the fire, and stories flowed freely. The POWs spoke of winters in Germany, of snowy fields and frozen rivers. The farmers spoke of similar winters in Iowa and Pennsylvania, drawing parallels that surprised both sides. Laughter mixed with awe as men discovered just how much history, culture, and human experience could overlap across oceans and generations. For many of the POWs, this was an emotional awakening. They had come expecting hardship, isolation, and hostility. Instead, they found themselves living among people who, despite decades and continents apart, shared echoes of their own past. Names like Wagner, Becker, and Schmidt were no longer just letters. They were reminders that the world was interconnected in ways they had never imagined. Even the children contributed to the bridge between worlds. A young boy might hand a prisoner a basket of eggs, giggling at the foreign accent of the man before him.
A girl might teach a POW a song her grandmother had sung, and suddenly a tune from Germany filled the American air. These small, innocent interactions became powerful symbols of hope and unity. And yet, amidst the familiarity, there was still learning. The POWs had to adapt to American farming methods, weather, and routines. They discovered machinery and tools unfamiliar to them, techniques that were different from those taught at home. With every new skill, every new lesson, mutual respect deepened. Even the guards began to notice the transformation. The men who once carried the tension of captivity now worked with diligence, patience, and a sense of pride. The lines between captors and prisoners blurred, replaced by mutual understanding and a shared commitment to the farm and the land. As approaching autumn, the fields were heavy with harvest, and the air carried the scent of hay, grain, and earth. The POWs moved through the crops with care, aware that they were not just laborers, but participants in a living tradition. They were part of something larger, a connection that spanned oceans, generations, and histories. By the end of this month, the German prisoners realized that what they had discovered went far beyond mere names or traditions. It was a bridge between people, a living testament that even in times of war, humanity could find common ground. They had been shocked initially, but now they were beginning to understand, to feel, and even to care. The farm had become a classroom of life, a place where lessons of culture, compassion, and shared heritage were taught not with words, but with deeds, names, and the quiet rhythm of daily life. And in this growing bond, the POWs saw a future different from the one they had imagined when they first arrived. A future where the echoes of their homeland could coexist with the land that had once seemed alien, hostile, and unreachable.
As winter approached, the German POWs had spent months working and living on American farms. The initial fear, resentment, and disbelief had long faded, replaced by understanding, respect, and an unexpected sense of belonging. Many of the prisoners now walked the fields with a familiarity that surprised even themselves. They knew which cows needed milking first, which rows of wheat required extra care, and how to read the subtle cues of the land. The farmers had taught them not just labor, but observation, patience, and a quiet reverence for nature. But it wasn't only the work that left its mark. It was the people. The families who had shared meals, stories, and laughter had opened their hearts to men who had been taught to see them as enemies. The children running and playing had reminded them of home, of innocence, and of continuity beyond war. Names became more than letters. Schmidt, Wagner, Miller, Becker. Each one carried the weight of history, ancestry, and connection. The POWs often found themselves thinking about these names during quiet evenings, reflecting on the irony and wonder of it all. They had been told to hate, to fight, and to survive, but instead they had learned empathy, kinship, and humility. One evening, as the sun set behind the barn, Hans gathered with his fellow prisoners. They spoke quietly of their families back in Germany, of the villages they missed, and of the lives they had imagined for themselves before the war. And yet, they realized that in this foreign land, among these Americans with German roots, they had discovered something equally precious, proof that humanity could transcend conflict. Letters began to be written not only to families back home, but to the farmers who had treated them with respect. Simple messages of gratitude, of shared memories, and of the unlikely bonds that had formed. Some farmers even kept small mementos, photographs of the POWs in the fields, letters recalling birthdays and harvest celebrations. It was a mutual exchange of respect and acknowledgement, small threads that wove lives together across continents. The POWs also reflected on the lessons of war itself. They had arrived expecting hatred, cruelty, and punishment. Instead, they found a nuanced world full of contradictions, compassion, and human connection. The experience challenged the black and white narratives of loyalty, enemy, and patriotism. They realized that identity was complex and that shared heritage could survive even centuries and oceans. As spring approached again, it was time for many of the POWs to be repatriated to Germany. Goodbyes were quiet but heartfelt. Farmers shook hands, embraced, and shared small tokens of remembrance. Some prisoners lingered a little longer, reluctant to leave the fields that had become so familiar, the families who had become unexpectedly dear. Even as the trains carried them back across the ocean, the memory stayed vivid. The smell of hay, the sound of children laughing, the sight of familiar German names on mailboxes. These were images they would carry forever. They understood that the war had ended one chapter, but a new understanding of humanity had begun within them. And for many years afterward, the POWs remembered the lessons learned on those farms. That kindness can bridge oceans, that shared history can soften enmity, and that in the most unlikely places, the echoes of home can be found. The experience stayed with them, not as a story of captivity, but as a story of revelation, of friendship, and of the enduring connections that tie people together across time, space, and circumstance. The farms of America had taught them a truth they had never expected, that even in war, humanity finds a way.
By the time several months had passed, the German POWs had settled into the rhythm of farm life, yet their understanding of the world had grown far beyond the boundaries of the fields. It wasn't just about planting, harvesting, or milking cows anymore. Every day offered subtle lessons that no classroom or camp could have provided. The prisoners began to notice the importance of patience, watching seedlings grow into crops, seeing animals respond to care and routine, and learning that consistent effort could yield meaningful results. They also observed the families themselves. Married couples worked side by side with a quiet harmony, sharing tasks without complaint or argument. Children ran errands, helped with chores, and learned responsibility early. The POWs marveled at this balance of hard work and care, realizing that life was about much more than orders and obedience. It was about relationships, trust, and mutual respect. At times, the prisoners were invited into homes for meals or gatherings. Here they discovered manners, customs, and family rituals that mirrored their own memories from Germany, yet had adapted to life in America. The sharing of food became a powerful ritual. Bread was torn and passed, soup ladled carefully into bowls, and stories flowed freely across the table. Even the simplest gestures, pouring a drink for someone, helping a child with a chore, or sharing a laugh over spilled milk, all became moments of insight. The prisoners began to understand that a nation could be strong and disciplined without losing its humanity, that leadership could be gentle, firm, and fair at the same time, that generosity could exist alongside responsibility, and that life's rhythm could carry both labor and love. Some prisoners started to keep mental notes, imagining how they might share these lessons back home. One thought about teaching neighbors in Germany how to work cooperatively. Another wondered how families might balance duties with care, or how children could be nurtured while still learning discipline. Even simple interactions had meaning. A child asking for help with a chore, a farmer showing a POW a technique for repairing a fence, or a shared laugh over spilled milk, all became moments of insight. The prisoners began to understand that these small moments, often overlooked, were the true foundations of life and community. Beyond practical skills, moral lessons emerged. They saw the power of patience with animals and plants, of listening to one another, and of understanding someone before judging them. The POWs reflected on how these small, everyday practices could prevent misunderstandings, conflict, and resentment in any society.
Sometimes, as the sun dipped low, the prisoners walked in silence through the fields. The wind carried the scent of earth and crops, and in those quiet moments, they contemplated their own lives. What had they truly understood about war, hate, and identity? What could they carry back with them, not as soldiers, but as men and human beings? Even guards occasionally joined them in these quiet walks. Conversations were honest, simple, and surprisingly revealing. The prisoners noticed that these men, tasked with maintaining order, were themselves bound by respect and fairness. It became clear that discipline did not require cruelty. And from that realization came gratitude, understanding, and a sense of belonging, even in captivity. As days turned into weeks, POWs began to anticipate the little moments of learning. They watched how farmers solved problems calmly, how families adapted to unexpected events, and how traditions were maintained with care. Every day was a lesson in resilience, patience, and the enduring value of human connection. By the end of this period, the POWs no longer saw themselves simply as laborers. They were students of life, absorbing knowledge from every task, conversation, and observation. The fields had become more than work. They were classrooms of humanity. The barns were lecture halls. The kitchens were schools of culture. And the families were teachers of empathy. And in this daily rhythm, one truth became clear. True understanding transcends borders, time, and conflict. Work, respect, patience, and human connection are universal. The German POWs had arrived expecting to endure. Instead, they were learning how to live. By the 7th month of their stay, the German POWs had grown deeply accustomed to life on the farms. But it wasn't just work or routine that held their attention. It was the stories. Stories of the past, stories of families, and stories that spanned oceans and generations. One evening, after a long day of harvesting, the prisoners gathered around the barn with a few farmers. Candles flickered, smoke rose gently from a small stove, and the hum of crickets filled the night. It was in this quiet space that stories began to flow, like threads weaving together distant lands. A farmer named Wagner spoke first. He told of his great-grandparents leaving a small village in Germany, carrying little more than hope and determination. He spoke of a treacherous ocean journey, of storms and fear, and of finally seeing the new world rise on the horizon. The POWs listened, rapt, recognizing the names of villages, the hardships of travel, and even the foods described in the story. Hans, a young prisoner, shared his own memories in return. He spoke of winters in Bavaria, of the sound of church bells on Sunday mornings, and of festivals where the entire village would gather to celebrate harvest and tradition. The farmer's eyes widened with curiosity. They could hear echoes of home in the prisoner's voice, a homeland so far away, yet surprisingly familiar. More stories followed. Miller described family traditions, the songs his grandparents taught, the recipes passed down through generations, and the small quirks of German life that had persisted even in America. The POWs nodded with understanding, amazed at how culture could survive oceans, borders, and decades. The evening stretched on, the night growing deeper. Some POWs shared childhood games, the way they had built small carts to play in the snow, or the mischief they had gotten into in the villages. Farmers laughed heartily, sharing their own stories of playful children, chores, and holidays. Every story revealed similarities, bridging the perceived gap between enemy and host, between Germany and America. Even the children joined in at times, timidly repeating words or singing songs handed down from their grandparents. The prisoners taught them German nursery rhymes, and in return learned songs and sayings unique to American-German descendant culture. It became clear that culture, memory, and heritage were alive in both worlds, overlapping and intertwining in ways neither side had expected. The prisoners began to record small details in their minds, storing away the lessons embedded in these stories. They noticed similarities in work ethic, in celebrations, and even in expressions of humor. It was not just a cultural discovery, it was a profound realization that human experience was universal. Over time, these evenings became a ritual. Farmers and prisoners alike shared food, songs, and laughter. A simple loaf of bread or a glass of milk became more than sustenance. It became a symbol of connection, of trust, and of the shared humanity that existed even in the shadow of war. The prisoners began to see their stay not as captivity, but as an unexpected journey into understanding. Each story, each shared memory was a lesson in resilience, empathy, and the surprising ways that human lives intersect. They saw that despite borders, wars, and generations apart, people could relate, sympathize, and learn from one another. And as winter approached, they knew that when they eventually returned to Germany, they would carry with them not only memories of fields and farms, but the profound truths contained in the stories shared across oceans, lessons about culture, kinship, and the enduring threads that bind humanity together.
As spring returned, it was time for many of the German POWs to leave the farms that had become a second home. Months of work, learning, and connection had passed, and the men faced a bittersweet reality. They would soon return to a world scarred by war, leaving behind the people who had changed their perspective forever. The farewell was quiet, yet deeply emotional. Farmers shook hands, embraced and exchanged small tokens, photographs, handwritten notes, and simple gifts that symbolize friendship and respect. Even the children, who had grown attached to the prisoners, lingered near the fences, shyly offering waves and smiles that said more than words ever could. Hans stood beside a farmer he had worked with every day. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice steady but eyes glistening. The farmer nodded, patting him on the shoulder. "You've done more than work here. You've become part of our lives. Remember that." Other POWs walked through the barns, touching familiar tools, smiling at cows they had tended, and pausing to look at the fields bathed in the golden light of early morning. Each step was a reminder of the lessons learned, the patience, the resilience, the care, and the deep humanity that had been so abundantly shared. On the train that would carry them back to Germany, the men reflected quietly. The fields, the families, the stories, they would stay with them forever. Names like Miller, Schmidt, Becker, and Wagner were no longer just letters. They were memories, bridges connecting continents and hearts. Some of the POWs wrote letters before departure. They thanked the farmers for their kindness, their patience, and the trust that had been given freely. They recounted small moments of joy, shared meals, songs, and laughter that had meant far more than they could have imagined. Even as the train rumbled forward, carrying them back to home, the men knew that the bonds formed on these American farms were enduring. They had been prisoners, yet they left with freedom and understanding, with respect in place of fear, and with memories that would shape the rest of their lives. Back in Germany, the POWs would carry these experiences into their communities. They shared stories with families, neighbors, and fellow veterans. They spoke of Americans not as enemies, but as people who had taught them empathy, patience, and the quiet power of shared heritage. The lasting impact was profound. Some returned to farming, inspired by the lessons learned. Some became teachers, passing on the values of respect, kindness, and cultural appreciation. All of them carried a deeper understanding of the human spirit, a knowledge that even amidst conflict, bridges could be built, hearts could be opened, and understanding could flourish. And in the quiet moments, when recalling the wind across the fields, the laughter of children, or the smell of fresh bread and earth, the POWs remembered the truth of their time on the farms.
that humanity is stronger than war, that friendship can flourish in unexpected places, and that even in captivity, the heart can find freedom. As the final train whistle echoed into the distance, the fields lay still, the barns quiet, but the bonds forged there remained unbroken. Across oceans, across generations, and across time, the lessons of those months on American soil would endure forever.
Back in Germany, the returning POWs faced a land still scarred by war. Cities were in ruins, families had endured hardship, and society was slowly trying to rebuild. Yet in their hearts, the lessons from the American farms lingered, quiet, powerful, and undeniable. As they reunited with families, old friends noticed a change. The men spoke with a calm patience that was new, a perspective shaped by months of labor, observation, and human connection abroad. They shared stories of children running through wide-open fields, of laughter echoing from barns, of names that bridged continents. And slowly, the people around them began to understand that this experience had transformed the POWs in ways words alone could not capture. Many of the men returned to work in agriculture, applying the techniques and approaches they had learned in America. They introduced methods of planting, harvesting, and animal care that they had observed on the farms. Neighbors marveled at the efficiency, the calm, and the care with which these former prisoners worked. Even small details, the patience, the gentle gestures, the way tasks were approached, reflected the lessons learned across the ocean. Beyond practical skills, the POWs carried a deeper cultural understanding. They appreciated the value of empathy, respect, and cross-cultural connections. They spoke of Americans not as enemies, but as people shaped by similar roots, traditions, and struggles. This perspective, unusual at the time, helped soften rigid narratives of wartime hostility in their communities. Some POWs corresponded with the farmers who had hosted them, maintaining friendships across oceans. Letters recounted harvests, family milestones, and reflections on the passage of time. Through these letters, the bond between Germany and America, once forged in the context of captivity, endured. The stories shared on the farms traveled across the Atlantic, creating a quiet network of understanding and reconciliation. The men also began sharing what they had learned with the next generation. Children, hearing stories of kindness, cooperation, and shared heritage, grew up with a vision of humanity that transcended borders and conflicts. Schools sometimes invited the returning POWs to recount their experiences, not as soldiers, but as witnesses to a remarkable lesson in empathy and connection. Over the years, many of these men realized that their time in America had changed their worldview permanently. They spoke of patience learned through tending crops, compassion learned from families, and understanding learned through cultural discovery. The names they had encountered, Miller, Schmidt, Wagner, Becker, remained etched in memory, not as labels of strangers, but as symbols of shared humanity. Some POWs even traveled back to America years later, visiting the farms and the families who had shaped this chapter of their lives. They were welcomed warmly, as friends and colleagues, rather than as former prisoners. The reunion was emotional, a full circle of experience, one that confirmed the lasting impact of the bonds formed decades before. In quiet moments, they reflected on the irony and wonder of it all. They had been brought to a foreign land as captives, taught to expect hardship and hostility, yet they found friendship, understanding, and connection instead. They had learned lessons that no academy could teach, lessons about empathy, resilience, trust, and the enduring nature of shared roots. And so the echoes of the farm lived on, not just in letters and memories, but in the way these men lived, taught, and nurtured future generations. The story of German POWs and American farmers became more than history. It became a testament to the power of human connection across boundaries, a reminder that even in the darkest times, bridges can be built and hearts can remain open. The lessons carried home were clear, that kindness transcends conflict, that culture endures across oceans, and that the smallest gestures, shared bread, a helping hand, a smile, can create bonds that last a lifetime. The farms, the families, and the lessons were gone physically,
yet they remained forever alive in the hearts of those who had experienced them, a permanent echo of hope, humanity, and connection.